Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Kim, and I'll be your moderator. I'm going to start off by saying we will be having a Q&A session after the presentation, but I'd ask that you, anytime throughout the presentation, submit questions at the send message link that you'll see at the top of the screen. And again, anytime throughout the presentation, I'll collect them and send them out to our presenters at the end of the webinar. For today, the goal of the webinar is to help guide you into making good voice decisions. And what that means is when you're looking into a voice self-service solution or reevaluating your existing setup, there's a lot of information to take into account. So we're going to start off with a look at current and future IVR capabilities. We're going to move forward into deployment options and then close out with implementation and maintenance. And we're also going to address some of the challenges you may encounter throughout the whole process. Again, we're going to close out with a Q&A and to your questions throughout the presentation. And now I'm going to introduce you to our speakers and we'll get started. First, we have Steve Weston, who is Managing Partner of Consulting at Epic Connections. And Steve is a BPO industry leader with over 25 years experience leading companies on transformational client solutions. And then we will have Tom Lewis, who is the CEO of Smart Action, and he was a leader of Deloitte's contact center advisory practice and has over 25 years experience focused on customer experience and contact center operations. So let's get started. Steve, over to you.
Morning, everyone. So I wanted to start with the kind of give you a little history here of the migration of IVRs as it migrates really from DTMF to natural language and beyond. As you all know, we started out with the DTMF options, which are really pretty basic prompting systems, allows you to gather some information up front, pretty limited in scope. It really serves as a way to kind of route and pace calls in your contact center. But because of the limitations from a customer experience perspective, as I think all of you have experienced, it's pretty basic, and therefore it was from a customer experience perspective is quite frustrating to the customer, going through all the prompts and trying to figure out what fits best, and they, many times end up just hitting zero because they get so frustrated, which defeats the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish in that section. We then migrated, obviously, into what we call direct dialogue, where you're now getting a little more interaction between the customer and the IVR. It's a little more intelligent than the straight DTMF and can have a little more intelligence in terms of trying to solve some of the customer's issues within the IVR. Here, you're starting to see some improvement in the customer experience, but again, because of its limitations in terms of what it can recognize, what we call really dictionary intelligence versus phonetic intelligence. If it's not exact, you don't get a match, and it's going to keep asking the customer to repeat because it doesn't understand. Again, a step in the right direction, but goal here again is to not only capture as much as you can within the IVR, but make it a seamless experience for the customer, whether they're in an IVR or with a customer. And because of that, we migrated today to some natural language. And that natural language really starts to allow the customer to have a more realistic and interactive conversation within an IVR as they would with a customer service rep. So we're starting to address a lot of those concerns. The customer experience is improving. Because of that, it's allowing them to actually service that many more calls in the system because of that. And most importantly, those who can't get serviced, it's really allowing for a lot more intelligent data that gets passed to a CSR, who then can in turn rapidly finish up what the IVR could not complete, thus again adding to a much more improved customer experience and a seamless transition out of the IVR into a customer service rep. One example, I think a lot of you might have heard when you go looking at trying to decide whether you stay with a DTMF or you go to natural language, some vendors really direct you away from the natural language, stating that it's very costly and the return on your investments are not as strong as they should be. I would tell you from experience that usually should be assigned to you, that vendor's natural language is not as accurate as it should be. Therefore, it's not able to recognize as much as a true natural language can, and thus you aren't going to get the return because of that. And that should be a hint that you need to look at a different application, because today's real natural language has an accuracy rate that's as high as 92%, and you can get that return. So if we go to the next slide, Tom's going to talk a little bit about more of the present and future of where we're headed with IVR technology today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. I appreciate that. And as what the audience hopefully can detect is that we're building out a framework here. And so we started with sort of the beginning elements of DTMF and introduction of voice, and then this is the next wave of things, and then we'll build upon this further as we go through the rest of the presentation. So the last box before we got to this slide was around some artificial intelligence, or natural language capability, rather, some natural language. And the next evolution is interfacing with an application or a voice self-service platform that uses all natural language. And the distinction here is, instead of just asking the intro question, how may I help you, and then defaulting back to a directed dialogue kind of conversation where it's yes-no prompts, and it doesn't have quite the flexibility that an open-ended prompt like how may I help you have, the idea of an all natural language platform is one that can handle not only that open-ended prompt, but also, even as it's going through basic parochial questions like yes or no or things like that, that it can handle a natural language conversation without doing the dreaded, I'm sorry, could you say yes or no type of thing. And so getting to an all-natural language platform throughout the entire flow is complex and also involves really designing conversations similar to the way that you would interact with a website. You think about a website, it's not this top-down, start here, next thing, and so forth, like the old IBM green screens are. The GUI, the graphical user interface that was introduced by the web, is something that the all-natural language motif is intended to emulate in terms of a GUI, or a voice user interface, which is less linear and allows the customer or caller to have a lot more control over the flow of the call. Definitely getting more sophisticated there. If you layer on top of that the cognitive abilities of artificial intelligence, that further refines not only what you heard, but also how to interpret it. And let me take a little side trip here for a second around AI, and this is a good way to sort of suss out who knows AI versus anything else, because a lot of people are throwing that buzzword around. And I think it's important to understand the difference between artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence. So in simple terms, AI is really just a machine. It is a purpose-built machine with business rules and perhaps some machine learning capabilities, and intended to achieve a certain task. AGI, on the other hand, has the ability to reason and have much more in terms of this self-awareness about it. And that's not what AI is, just to be clear. The analogy that's often drawn is, if you think about the flight of a bird as something that man has been trying to create for centuries, and still has really not replicated the flight of a bird, but yet man flies all the time. In fact, I got to catch a flight this afternoon on a plane. That's a rough facsimile that achieves the same goal or purpose of the bird. And so the analogy would be the plane is to artificial intelligence as the bird is to artificial general intelligence. So moving on from there, once you have the AI piece and the ability to then use that inside of an IVR, you're then able to really do some deductive reasoning. Things like when somebody says, no, not that, or the second one, or relative or ordinal types of conversations, things that require context from previous parts of the conversation flow, that's where artificial intelligence really shines. And then finally, machine learning, which is a form of artificial intelligence, but it's really something very specific that's predicated on collecting data and understanding where things have happened in the past and are likely to happen again, and whether that is remembering how certain things are spelled, remembering particular codes or information from one particular customer, and so that they say it again in a follow-up call, it's likely that that's the same reason that they're calling again, et cetera, along those lines. And so building upon the data that you have. One creative use I've seen for this is that when exceptions occur inside the call center, and ordinarily they would present options in the call tree a particular way or provide certain information a particular way, and if there's a snowstorm or longer hold queues or things like that, without actually even telling the IVR, it should be able to see, okay, the system's behaving this way, and so I should present my prompts this way. And so using machine learning, there's probably an unlimited supply or unlimited use cases for that. But this is the evolution that takes us to basically where we are today, because the AGI IVR doesn't exist today, and that's sort of the next thing that's probably off the side of the page here. We'll get to that in N number of years. So now that we've gotten through these 6 building blocks, Steve, let me turn it back over to you and talk about some of the important capabilities and operating model and so forth associated with deployment strategy and whatnot.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. So let's talk about, a little bit about the characteristics of what a deployment strategy should look like. Obviously, it's extremely important that you define the scope of actually what you're trying to determine and what you're trying to implement itself from an IVR. And this goes everything from what your goals are, what you want to capture in an IVR, everything from then what your scripting should look like, your prompting and your decision trees should look like, because the better defined you are up front, the better chances you are of being more successful in that deployment itself. And as you go ahead and then deploy your IVR solution, it's important then you start fine-tuning and using change orders up front, because you're going to find you're going to hit some goals you're not going to hit. And a lot of it is you want to get the right data out of the IVR itself that's going to show you where people are being successful in capturing the data you would like to capture, where people are falling out in the prompts, which prompts are being used the most, because that'll obviously influence the order you're doing. And that all goes into really tuning up front, and ongoing tuning is crucial. And this is where a lot of companies fall down a bit, is when they get the capture rates that they would like to, and they're getting the customer experience that they would like to, and then they just kind of leave the IVR system alone. And then all of a sudden, months later, you're seeing your percentages go right back to the way they were. It's important that you're constantly looking at methods to keep the data fresh and staying on top of the analytics that you get out of an IVR to ensure you're maintaining those characteristics of the capture rate as well as the customer experience. There are various fee options that you can see, that you can use. Straight licensing versus usage, and this will get into a bit in cloud versus prem, which we'll get into a few minutes. Looking at overall costs of maintenance and upgrades that you need to do. Again, those constant improvements and upgrades, if you're using a prem system, can be costly versus cloud. This gives you a little more flexibility itself. But you want to, again, constantly improve on your deployment and your deployment strategies. So if we go on to the next, let's take a closer look on the next slide as to what should I do? Do I go cloud? Do I go prem? If I'm on prem, do I need to be replacing everything to go cloud? There are basically 3 questions you really need to ask yourself as to determining whether cloud versus prem. Obviously, is this my core competency? In most companies, the answer usually is no. I know my business, but in terms of what best practices are and how to structure the IVR and how to maintain the IVR, many companies have issues in doing that. The second, obviously, is this going to make a differentiator in my business in the marketplace? Many times, yes, obviously it does, because we're all being weighed on that customer experience, CSAT, Net Promoter Score, and so on. But do I have the expertise to make it make this a differentiator in my business? And is it going to be more cost effective whether I go cloud versus prem? I mean, remember, when you're going into a cloud environment, you're going into, and this goes to our next slide, you're going into an OpEx versus a CapEx model. So it allows you to invest in the most up-to-date state-of-the-art technology with limited capital, as well as gaining the expertise from a managed services model within cloud to maintain the IVR itself, and getting the best prompting and the best scripting that's going to maximize your return. And on the other hand, I've got a pretty decent IVR on-prem, and I hate to reinvest money and start all over again. You need to weigh then, and there are options where you don't necessarily have to replace all what you've done on the prem side, but but can migrate a lot of that functionality to cloud itself. So I guess what we're saying here is you got to have a structured deployment strategy, and these are the questions that you need to go through in asking whether cloud or prem are my best options.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. In fact, one note as we were putting this together, and Steve and I discussed when we originally thought about the webinar, it's like, okay, yeah, there's a bunch of different ways to do IVRs, but that last slide certainly highlighted all the different decisions that you have to make in terms of ownership and control and all that kind of stuff. So that's good information. Thanks a bunch, Steve. Appreciate that. But the next thing that we thought about was, so what does the average client end up doing in terms of implementation, and what are the challenges that they face as they go through what can be a fairly painful journey? And so I'd like to highlight a few things that just make sure that you think about as you go through the decisioning process, and have this on your radar in terms of scope and effort and whatnot. So the first one Steve highlighted was around tuning, and certainly you need to tune the system. And in fact, actually, let me do this. I'm going to start on the right-hand side of this page and start with the defining of the scope. And so the scope of the project, obviously you want to know what you're going to automate, but what's more important is that it impacts the implementation costs, whether those are internal or external, because someone in your organization will say, well, depending upon how big it is, I'll have a better idea of how much effort I have to apply to it. So that's where the thing starts off, and that's obviously where the first thing people think about is how big is the breadbox. The next thing around scripting is how detailed are you going to design this thing, and are I made the analogy to the GUI and VUI and IBM green screen and so forth. And so are you putting a whole bunch of Visio diagrams together, and is this going to end up being a linear design where you start at the top and you work your way down just like the old IBM green screens, and how are you going to design all that? And what technology you're going to use? Are you going to use VXML? Are you going to use MRCP? Are you going to use object-oriented coding, or what? And then how about speech talent? Are you going to use your own speech talent? Have you got branded speech talent? Are you going to use TTS, text-to-speech, where the machine is converting it, similar to the way Siri and Echo and Cortana and those things all work? And then you get to tuning. So I jumped the gun a little bit there. So tuning, basically, do you have a process so that you don't do a one-time tune during the deployment and then say 90 days later say, all right, it's tuned. In fact, that leads to sort of a set it and forget it mentality, which can be dangerous because nothing really stands still. And in fact, your success is probably going to decrease over time, unless, of course, you issue some change orders. Steve also highlighted this. Change orders could be, $0 ones, but basically refining the scope and defining what needs to change. And on the other hand, if it's a external professional services organization, that can add up quickly. And in fact, often is a barrier for companies because they don't have the budget to do the enhancements. And so the system tends to stay flat and what we often refer to as completion rate atrophy, meaning that the completion rate or the success of the system starts to atrophy over time. And then as we talked about the evolution of IVRs, is it using natural language? If so, is it using it throughout, or is it inconsistent in the way it deployed it? So these are some challenges in the part of the journey of going down an IVR, not to mention that, sometimes when the consumer thinks about IVR, they're not all that excited. In fact, if you ask the general American population what they think about IVRs, they usually aren't using pleasant words around it. The focus in customer service and customer care is all around customer experience. We've all heard that. And the other one is customer effort, making sure that the amount of effort that the caller has to take to get the job done is less than it would take to actually do it through another channel. In fact, callers typically pick the channel that they pick, whether it's on a smartphone or a website or what have you, based on whichever channel they think is going to take the least amount of effort to get the task done. And so considering all of that, if you're going to implement an IVR, you need to make sure that it has an effortless experience with a good customer experience associated with it. So that rounds out most of the content. We've tried to be fairly broad stroke and maybe a little academic in the way we've presented this. But to put it in context, I think what might be useful is if Steve and I just briefly, just if you'll indulge us for about a minute, to give you the context of where we're coming from and the skills that we provide, and then we have one more slide to sort of put it all together in terms of this framework. So Steve, if you wouldn't mind talking about your high-level value proposition, and then I'll do the same.
Sure, Tom. So real quick, it really highlights some of the things we talked about earlier. So Epic brings to the table that vertical expertise that allows us to analyze your environment, comparing it to similar businesses and what has worked in terms of that customer experience and the ability to maximize the returns and the goals that you're setting out for your IVR project. Obviously, with that customer experience is we bring that ability to bring your costs down while improving the overall service levels for your operation. And most importantly, 25 years plus experience within our IVR practice that allows us to really not only design the right solution, but we get our hands dirty and actually work with you to help optimize and maximize the returns that we promise. We basically put our money where our mouth is at that point. Tom, a bit about Smart Action?
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. So when you think about Smart Action, we hope you walk away with three key ideas. One is that we're the only platform that's got that artificial intelligence, machine learning, and 100% natural language capabilities. So the technology is ahead of pretty much anybody else out there in the market. In fact, I wouldn't qualify it as pretty much. I would say ahead of anybody else in the market, which makes it very innovative. Our innovative business model is also that we're selling a service. So all of those pain points I just went through on that challenges slide, none of them exist in this environment. We'd love to tell you more about that. And finally, we're really focused on what it is your customers are trying to do. So for our clients, what is the customer experience around, and is it an effortless experience? So taking them on that journey. So as I promised, we have one more slide to show you, and that is putting this all together on one framework. And so when you think about the capabilities, we started with DTMF, in other words, touch tone, and worked all the way to machine learning. And the size of the blocks are intended to indicate the sort of the complexity and size and whatnot around it. But also, if you'll notice that red shading, it's around the fact that very often, if you're going to do this yourself, you're probably going to need some expertise in this area, which is one of the reasons why Steve was highlighting the in-source versus outsource pieces of the puzzle. So as things get exponentially more complicated and sophisticated, albeit with better customer experience, you also tend to need some external assistance. And then from a deployment options and capabilities standpoint, these Rubik's Cube and gears all point to different ways of enabling and bringing to bear the things that are important to you as an organization, as well as the things that are required for your particular business processes. So it was difficult to put all of this on one slide because we were hoping that this was a matrix or it was simple. And the fact is there are so many different levers and dials and ways to configure this that you have to give it some thought. And that, in fact, is the gist and the reason we put this webinar together is to make sure that people thought about all the different things that they had to consider in this journey. I do not hear Kim, so she did send me some questions via the platform as we were going along. So I think one or two of these might be ones that you can answer, Steve, and I'll go ahead and maybe answer one or two as well. So the first question for you, Steve, is why is evolving IVR technology even an issue when these days most people are looking at the web, smartphones, social, et cetera? Is it worth the investment from an IVR perspective?
Yeah, that's a really solid question, and we get that asked quite a bit. Bottom line is, yes, it is still a necessary and key component of your communication strategy with your customers. And I'll tell you why. Yes, social media is up and coming, but I would tell you that it is still a very small, maybe single digits to low double digit component of the customer experience in terms of the channels that people are using. And more and more companies are trying to figure out a more effective multi-channel strategy. Secondly, obviously, it depends on the demographics of your customer base. So you're going to have some customers, probably your younger population, that are more apt to use the social media and other multi-web and chat and so on, versus some of your older, more senior customer base are still used to either talking to an individual or potentially using an IVR. And three, that IVR component really sets the stage for that overall customer experience going forward. So it captures quite a bit of data for you and your customers. It determines really the routing strategy of where that call's going to go. And ultimately, that call could go out of an IVR into another channel, depending on what data is gathered. But it is a crucial component in terms of how you stage that communication strategy.
Very good. And I hear people talking about omni-channel and multi-channel and all these other kind of things, and the fact of the matter is, whatever channel works, I would think, in terms of getting that to that effortless experience is probably a key element to all this as well. Got another question in here. See if I can decipher it. It says, already have an an on-prem solution, but want to move to the cloud. Also want to make some IVR enhancements. Does this mean I need to scrap everything I've already built and start over? So my answer to that is you do want a consistent experience throughout your IVR, but often the clients of ours have a pretty robust and decent upfront call routing. And in those cases, maybe that's fine. Just leave it as is. But the question is, can you automate some of the low-value tasks that live agents are doing and automate those? And if that's the case, then you should be able to just insert the IVR between that routing up front, which you've already invested a ton of money and time in, and the live agents. And by putting it in between there, you don't have to actually start over or scrap anything. In fact, you can continue to leverage that investment that you've already made. Now, at some point, if the self-service and whatnot is moving along and it makes sense to create a unified experience, then fine, move back upstream once you've got all this self-service in place, and you could potentially replace the routing. But that might come down the road a little bit. Okay, and then Kim sent me one more question. I'm not sure. Let me see who should answer this. It says, are there any security risks I need to consider when thinking about a cloud solution? Steve, why don't I have you answer that one?
Sure. Yeah, obviously, I think they're the normal, whether you go cloud or prem, you want to go through the normal security audit, and whether it's PCI, HIPAA, depending on your business and your business model, that's no different. I would say that the extra step you probably want to just check when you do your security audit is, one of the great things about cloud, although it's multi-tenant, which means you're basically, you're sharing a component with other customers. There's that firewall, so your data never leaves or never really crosses that barrier line. But when you're doing a security audit, you certainly want to double check on the multi-tenant in terms of whether you are sharing a cluster with other customers and the firewalls that maintain your data. So I guess what I'm telling you is whether you go cloud or prem, your security audit should be the same. There is really no increased security risk between cloud and prem outside of the areas that I just highlighted.
Fantastic. Seems like you had an electrical outlet or electrical power problem, and seems like Kim, unfortunately, her phone died, but she was able to send us those questions, and she indicated that there was no additional questions besides those three. So with that, in about half an hour, what I'd like to remind everybody is that we will send out a link to this recording so that you can share, as well as we have an additional piece of collateral around what we call a maturity model that highlights things that are good and bad in terms of effort and experience and whatnot within a given IVR. Again, it has nothing to do with Smart Action. It just has to do with evaluating IVRs. And we'd be happy to share with that with you as well. Just simply reach out to us, and we'll be happy to share that with you. So on behalf of Kim and Steve, I'd like to thank everybody for their participation today, and thank you for listening in on our conference, and we'll see you next month on the next webinar. Thank you.